Buenos días. Uy, ahora mucho mejor. Como decía, os presento a la profesora Jan McArthur, que es profesora titular en el Departamento de Investigación Educativa de la Universidad de Lancaster y miembro también investigador del Center for Global Higher Education. Sus intereses principales versan sobre dos temas: educación y justicia social y la naturaleza de la educación superior. Igualmente está interesada sobre las interrelaciones entre educación y sociedad y teoría y práctica de estas. También ha explorado diferentes interpretaciones de la pedagogía crítica, en especial las formas en que las conceptualizaciones del conocimiento impactan en la justicia social. Su trabajo reciente ha analizado la naturaleza de la evaluación y la retroalimentación y su papel en el fracaso escolar, incluyendo la relación entre las concepciones del fracaso y la justicia social. Ha escrito un último libro denominado Evaluación para la Justicia Social, que ha sido traducido al español recientemente y lo podemos adquirir en esta mesa que hay aquí a la salida de la derecha, así que luego le podéis echar un vistazo. Y el objetivo del libro es explorar el potencial de promover la justicia social dentro y a través de la evaluación en la educación superior, basándose en la teoría crítica de Alex Honnold. Y ya os dejo con ella. Aproximadamente la presentación tendrá una duración de 50 minutos y luego tendremos el turno para preguntarle.
Thank you very much for that welcome and for being here with you all. I'm absolutely delighted. Just as a little bit of background, I'm actually Australian, but I live in Scotland and I work in England. So if my accent sounds strange, that's why. It also means we have an Australian theme to the keynotes, which I hope is a good thing. What I'm going to talk about today is my work on assessment for social justice. And my work occupies a rather strange place in the scholarship of higher education. And I'd almost even say it's a bit of a lonely place to be, because for the philosophers, my work isn't philosophical enough, and they wonder, why are you bothering with this thing called assessment? And for the assessment people, it's, well, couldn't you have more on assessment? And why do we need all this theory? We're okay as we are. But I passionately believe in the power of rigorous theorisation to inform what we do and how we can improve and change. So the conference theme is student involvement in assessment, and some ways of looking at this would be to think of what the student can do, such as peer and self-assessment, to think about the student having a role in deciding how they are assessed, or thinking about students developing the literacy with which to undertake assessment tasks. And all of these are very important aspects of student involvement. But what I want to talk about today is something slightly different, something complementary. I want to talk about the student as a whole person and the impact of assessment on the student as a whole person. Not just a person, but a social person, a member of society. When I reflected back on what I had to say today, I was worried that you might be like somebody who gets a parcel in the mail and is very excited only to open it and find an empty box. Because for a good part of today, I might not seem to be talking about assessment, but I promise you, everything I have to say is, in my view, very closely linked to assessment, given the importance of assessment to what we do within higher education. And I will, in the second part of the talk, get more directly onto talking about assessment examples. But just to sort of explain my way of situating what I'm doing in the existing scholarship on assessment in higher education. If we place our student as a whole person at the centre of what we do, and it's not just the student, but it's her engagement with knowledge, And note there I'm saying engagement with knowledge and not learning, and that's for a reason which will become clear as we go on. And what the assessment for learning literature has shown is that the nature of assessment will shape how and what that student learns, and that this is incredibly important. And then we have work, and David Bowd's work here is really important, that there are several legitimate purposes of assessment, and the nature of the purpose may shape what's an appropriate method, which then shapes the engagement with learning. And what I'm simply wanting to do is say, let's talk more about this outer layer. It is recognised in some literature, but not explored in depth. And think about how society, how a commitment to social justice, worrying about injustice pathologies, aspiring to well-being and inclusion, how these then also have an impact. And then in fact, the relationship between them is running both directions through all layers. So the outline of what I want to talk about today is I'm going to expand a little bit on what I mean by a philosophical account of students' involvement. And then I have three themes which are interrelated: knowledge, social justice and assessment, individual and social well-being, and social and economic beyond the world of work. So, a philosophical account. Well, my own approach is based very strongly in critical theory, which challenges the assumption that society, as it is currently organised, is benign, is harmless, and sees instead that there are hidden powers and pathologies that can harm human life, and we should be working towards the flourishing of each and every person as an individual. I've been particularly influenced by, in a general way, by early critical theorists Horkheimer and Adorno there on the left. And I realise, I will say that these are all white men. There are female critical theorists. Nancy Fraser's work is very important, and I use her in other things. But for this, I've taken general inspiration from Horkheimer and Adorno, and then from Axel Honneth, who's in the smaller photo. We have a theory of social justice, which I think is workable. And by that I mean we can do something with it when we think about the everyday practices of assessment. And I think it's very important to theorise social justice, because it can't just be a feel-good term. Oh yeah, of course we all agree with that. And it can't be so vague that, oh well, it can mean anything, so let's not bother about it. So this brings me to my book on assessment for social justice. And the simple argument is that if assessment is so central to shaping what and how students learn, and if we are committed to greater social justice in higher education, as I am, then surely assessment needs to be front and centre as part of that social justice mission. And I was delighted when the book was translated into Spanish. But the funny thing about it is, and Gregorio very generously wrote a foreword to it, but of course not reading Spanish, I have no idea what he said about me or my book, which is a funny feeling. So I asked a colleague who speaks Spanish, could you tell me the sense of what's here? And she came back with two things, and I don't know if they're correct, so please forgive me if they're not. The first was that he said that I was against convention, and I liked that very much as a description, so I hope you said it. Thank you. And the second was that while these ideas were important, they might not be practical or appropriate in a Spanish context. And I didn't know whether that meant that there were rules, regulations that would stop these things, or whether there were cultural expectations about assessment. But you can see, coming to speak with you today, this presents something as a problem for me. But thinking about it, what I want to say is that the ideas in this book are not meant to be a list of what you must do. It's more about opening a conversation to say, if we care about social justice in higher education, can we start thinking about assessment differently? And I think that's, and so it may have a different shape in a different context, but there is still a conversation that I think we can have. And I want to share with you two quotes, which for me are very powerful and central to this idea. The first is from Horkheimer. It need not be so. It's a very simple thing, but I believe it's very powerful. And it comes from a 1937 essay, Between Critical and Traditional Theory. And this is actually the first time ever the term critical theory is used. And what Horkheimer said was, if we look at the unjust society, critical theory says it need not be so, and the conditions for change exist. We're not looking for magic or a miracle. We have within us the abilities to question and change. And in a similar theme, Adorno warns against the passive acceptance of what is merely the case. How often have you heard people say, oh well, that's just the way it is? But surely in higher education, we should be a place where we can think beyond the passive acceptance of what is merely the case. We have this ability to think differently. So to the first of my themes, knowledge, social justice and assessment. In a book before my assessment one, I wrote a book called Rethinking Knowledge Within Higher Education, Adorno and Social Justice. And in this, I argued that the distinctive purpose of higher education is the way in which we engage with knowledge. We're not the only place that does it, but we're a place where it's central to what we do. And I argued that if you're committed to social justice, that knowledge needs to have four qualities. Firstly, that it's engagement with complex and contested forms of knowledge. Knowledge that is not easy to know. Secondly, that there has to be active participation. So again, not just memorization. And that active participation means that there's going to be risk and uncertainty. And thirdly, that we need these spaces to escape the mainstream and the status quo. Higher education isn't about being on a little treadwheel and going round and round and round, constantly rediscovering the same. It's about that capacity to think outside and beyond. And finally, that theory and practice, doing and thought, are intricately related, and this comes very much from Adorno, that thinking is itself a powerful act. And if we understand that, we can release the emancipatory potential of knowledge. And so bringing these three things together, what I did in the first book was look at this relationship between knowledge and social justice. And to my embarrassment, I wrote very little about assessment. It was before I saw the light and came to see how central assessment is to students and higher education. So I tried to remedy that in, if you like, the sequel. But what I'm increasingly interested in is the relationship between all three of these. And I think that we have to, if we're committed to social justice, think across all three. And one useful influence here is the British sociologist Basil Bernstein, who talks about a pedagogic device. And this is the idea that knowledge gets interpreted, legitimised and transformed as it goes through different contexts. And that these are sites of struggle about what it is legitimate to know, or the legitimate nature of knowledge. And so we have the production of knowledge, which is in the research that we do. And then that's transformed into the curriculum and goes through a process of change. And then it's transformed again when students have their understanding of it, which they express when they engage in assessment tasks. and that in these three levels, the knowledge is slightly different, and yet it can't be unrecognisably so. And Sue Ellen Shea has said, if we're trying to grapple with the idea of standards, which are so important to assessment, and how do we work out what the standards are? We can't just simply say we have standards. We have to be able to produce or show evidence of what they are. Then this relationship between these levels of knowledge may be helpful. But more than that, Sue Ellen Shea says that the specialisation of certain kinds of knowledge is at the same time the specialisation of certain kinds of knowers. So think back here to our student as a whole person. If we have certain sorts of knowledge regarded as legitimate, certain sorts of knowers are going to be regarded as legitimate. And she goes on, evaluative criteria not only legitimate texts, they legitimate knower identities. So the nature of knowledge is really important for our student as a whole person. And Bernstein was writing about the difference between elites and non-elites, but in the current context, we can apply this to things like Miranda Fricker's work on epistemic injustice, to the decolonising the curriculum movement, and the why is my curriculum white. All of these movements are challenging the idea of what is counted as legitimate knowledge in higher education. So they are sites of struggle. And I want to give an example of how this matters. And I want to use the discipline of economics. And I do so because this was my first discipline, my first degree. And I did economics at a time when we had all sorts of different thinkers. Oh, we had, the Marxists, the Keynesians, the monetarists, every colour, shape and form of economist was there in my undergraduate education. But over the last 30 or 40 years, it could be argued that economics has become increasingly narrow, and not just about neoclassical economics, but a very narrow interpretation. And what happens when what counts as legitimate knowledge becomes too narrow? What's the impact on students' identity? And I'm going to give you two examples. The first is a student called Pauline, from a paper by Richardson. Pauline chose to study economics, and she actually was studying at the same place I went to. She chose to study economics because she's interested in the world around her. She wants to understand it more. She follows current affairs, she reads the newspapers, she watches the news on telly. She's a dream student because she does all the extra reading, she does all her work, she's on time, she's engaged. She's everything we say we want our students to be. And so she's given an assessment to do, to explain the concept of opportunity cost and to use a real-world example. So Pauline gets very excited about this, and she thinks, what could I use as my example? So she lives in Melbourne, and at the time there was debate over building a casino. So there's lots of social and economic costs involved, and she thinks, I could use that as my example. That would be really helpful. Also going on at the same time was a debate about bringing the Grand Prix back to Melbourne. And again, a lot of different social and economic costs and benefits. So she gets really excited. Which one will she choose? But then Pauline pauses because Pauline has already done some other assessments and she has learnt things through those assessments. And what she's learnt is that's not what they mean by the real world. So what example does she choose? Shortage of cotton in the cotton industry. There's no cotton industry in Melbourne, there's no shortage. But that's the real world example because that's the one in the textbook. Now, I think this is an awful example, and it's far from on its own, of how assessment can do harm. My second example is the post-crash economic societies. I don't know whether you had these in Spain, but particularly after the 2008 economic crisis, it galvanised a number of students in the UK who were studying economics, and there was a lot of talk at the time of the crash, well, where were the economists? Why didn't they know this was going to happen? And these students felt that their discipline had become so narrow that it was no longer fit for purpose and that they were not getting the education they deserved. And most famously, the students at Manchester University wrote this document, and it is an absolutely stunning piece of scholarship. It is very well researched, argued, analysed and written. And this was all done by students, not to get a mark, not to pass a test, but because they cared about their own education, they cared about their discipline, and they cared about the social world. And their argument was that economics had become so narrow that students who were interested in some of the parts of the discipline, like the history of economic thought, alternative theories, comparative economic systems, these were now considered not serious students of economics, not our kind of people, not the right sort of student. And in addition, the students said that there was a contrast between the laudable institutional values and mission statements of their universities that said we're about creating critical thinkers, independent people, people who can go on and contribute to industry and society. And yet, when it came to the teaching, learning and assessment, they were living in this monoculture of just one variety that wasn't questioned. And when it came to assessment, the students argued in this document that what they want their institutions to do is to provide substantive assessment of students' ability to engage with and criticise theory and to develop arguments for positions in which there is no one correct answer. They wanted access and to be tested on their ability to engage with complex knowledge. So to conclude this section, what counts as legitimate knowledge is a site of struggle. We can't just assume that knowledge is there and doesn't change and isn't influenced by things. The legitimisation of knowledge is the legitimisation of certain student identities. Higher education loses its distinctive purpose if knowledge is not complex, contested and dynamic. And assessment should not be about technique, but about how are we engaging with knowledge. So my second theme is about individual and social well-being. And this is at the heart of a critical theory approach, is the interrelationship between these two. So let me go back in time again to Horkheimer and a speech he gave in 1931 when he became director of the Frankfurt School, the Institute for Social Research. And he said its ultimate aim is the philosophical interpretation of the vicissitudes of human fate, the fate of humans not as mere individuals, however, but as members of a community. And coming up to more recent times, Axel Honneth, third generation critical theorist, says, we know what is just by that which allows the individual member of our society to realise his or her own life objectives in cooperation with others and with the greatest possible autonomy. So we think back to our student as a whole person. This is what we're trying to achieve through their higher education experience. And assessment is an important part of that. And thus, Honneth has a theory of social justice based on mutual recognition. So social justice is about personal identity formation of our student as a whole person, and individual self-realisation, but this happens through mutual recognition, that is, relationships with others. Now, for the next 3 or so slides, I'm going to go a little deeper into the theory, But I promise after that we come out the other side and I'll be talking a lot about assessment. So please bear with me. Honneth's theory of mutual recognition says that there are 3 realms of recognition which are interrelated. The first is love or care, and this is about primary relationships, the particular intimate relationship between a father and his son. And it's about that most basic sense of us being recognised as a person of worth by someone else. Quite different is respect recognition. This is about universal rights, and not just having rights, but understanding them and using them. And then thirdly, there's esteem recognition, which is about the individual. And it's about the traits and abilities an individual has through which they can contribute to the social whole. So it's not saying these are the same for everyone. It makes no sense to say we're all equally good at everything, because we're not. But each of us have different individual contributions to make. And then I want to add to this another, or sort of force in, or add in, another piece of work. Because one of the criticisms of critical theory, which is partly fair and partly not, is that it's very good at critique and not so good at change. But what is really good at change is social practice theory. Understanding assessment as a series of practices, and if you understand the nature of those practices, you can then affect change. And so Theodore Shatsky has 4 elements to practices. Practical understandings, which is simple know-how, how to pick up a pen, how to write. Rules. So are you allowed to take a calculator into an exam? As a rule, that then shapes the practice of the exam. It's different whether you take the calculator in or not. Taleo-affective structures, which are simply why we're doing something and why that matters. And then this last one, which he added in his later work, general understandings, which is an elusive concept, but it's best understood as senses of worth. So Shatsky gives the example of some traditional Christian craftspeople who make furniture and believe that in the way they make it, they're making a tribute to the glory of God. And so that sense of worth shapes the nature of the practice of making that piece of furniture. Or a simpler example would be courtesy. If you have courtesy as a sense of worth, it will shape the practice of doing your shopping in a busy supermarket or travelling home on a crowded train. So what I've tried to do is to think about what senses of worth could help shape practices so that we realise social justice in the way outlined by Honneth. And this is not a definitive list. This is just a starting point for a conversation. But what I suggest is that a belief in trust and honesty would help in terms of care recognition, and is all about the strong pedagogical relationships that need to underpin assessment, and about honesty about marking processes. If we give one student 62% and another student 63%, those students legitimately think that we can tell the difference, but there's no evidence that we can, and so we shouldn't be doing that. Responsibility is about respect. It's about informed and active engagement with marking criteria, the rules and the regulations. And forgiveness and responsiveness refer to the nature of knowledge and therefore esteem recognition. Complex, hard-to-know knowledge that is connected to the social world. And it's this last one about responsiveness that I want to talk about in terms of assessment today. So a responsive assessment is one that's responsive to what the student brings to the practice, to the social world in which it is situated, and enables the achievement of esteem recognition, a sense that you have something positive to contribute to the social world. and esteem recognition then, to recap, the development of skills and attributes through which one makes a positive social contribution to the social whole, is recognised by others, and really importantly, recognises this in themselves. This is what we want our students to recognise in themselves as they do their assessment tasks. So if we go back to Pauline, what we have is a case of misrecognition, of injustice, because she sought to connect her engagement with knowledge and her assessment tasks to the social world in which she lived. And yet she felt pressured to just go back to the textbook, which probably hasn't been updated in goodness knows how long anyway. So now I want to turn to some data from a project that I'm involved in called Understanding Knowledge, Curriculum and Student Agency. This is part of the Centre for Global Higher Education, and you see there my fellow researchers. And this is a fantastic project to be part of. We're tracking students' engagement with disciplinary knowledge over time, so it's both longitudinal and comparative, based in the UK, South Africa and the US, 2 institutions in each country. And we're looking at chemistry and chemical engineering. And we chose these because we felt that they were under-researched and that they were distinctive by being, if you think of the classification of pure, applied, soft and hard disciplines, these are non-life disciplines. But the funny thing is, when we went to talk to colleagues to ask if we could research, and they said, why are you interested in us? And we said, oh, because you're a non-life discipline. And they looked in horror and said, what do you mean? Chemistry is at the centre of all human activity. Chemical engineering is at the centre of all human activity. So that taught us a lesson. We've interviewed over 150 students, and about 100 of these we have or will follow through 4 years, and we've now just got the funding to follow them for another 3, so we're taking them from their first year out into the world of work or whatever they go on to do. So that's going to be very exciting. Thinking of first year in particular, which is going to be my focus today, assessment is built into nearly every stage of the curriculum. There's lots of different assessment methods. These students are being assessed all the time. And so what I was interested in, if the goal is this esteem recognition, this sense of a positive social contribution, what would count as achievement for these students? Because they have to recognise it in themselves. And so I came up with this spectrum of what I call responsiveness to the social world. So at one level, achievement is simply grades obtained. I got an A, I got a first, I got a high GPA. That's good, that's the end of it. Very, very few of our students, first-year students, thought in that way, which I think is very pleasing. Far more common was to see achievement in terms of something to do with knowledge. So this was knowledge learned. I've learnt about this molecule in chemistry, and I'm pleased about that. That's good to know. The practical application of knowledge, I've learnt about this molecule, and I can apply it to make this compound. The future application of knowledge in the social sphere, I've learnt about this molecule, I can apply it to make this compound, and this is useful because in industry, it's used to produce a certain type of material. And then the final one, the future application of knowledge in the social sphere towards the social good. This molecule becomes this compound, becomes this material, which is useful because in the building industry, they use it to make affordable housing for poorer people. So it has an important social function. So let me take you through a few of the quotes from our students to give a sense of how they described assessment and achievement. So the first one, simply grades. If you get 40%, you probably don't understand it. The person who gets 100% is clearly better at in some way than you. So the grade is a perfect indicator of the knowledge that they've learned. This is interesting. This is a student who's gone through a transition. When I was in high school, I used to think that the purpose of an assessment was just to show the teachers that you can do it. Look, I'll get this mark. Since I've come to university, I've seen that it's all about making the knowledge stronger in your head. Making the knowledge stronger in your head. What a fantastic thing for a student to say. And then the practical application. I quite like working in a lab, and I enjoy working accurately and making sure everything happens that is meant to happen. I also like doing the lab reports because I like to see how things that I've learnt in the lectures actually work physically. I can actually see it happening. And then the practical application of knowledge in the social sphere. I had to do a 3-page report on cellulose. So I wrote about how it's manufactured and where it comes from, and something called the celluloid fibres. Celluloid in itself isn't actually that good to use in industry, but you can make something called celluloid fibres, which are quite useful. And so finally, practical application in the social sphere for the social good. And sadly, none of my students had anything to say here. Which is okay, because these are, it could be for a number of reasons. So this is where looking at the data across the different years, will this change? Will there be differences between the two disciplines? And will there be international differences? And I can tell you that looking at preliminary analysis of the second year South African data, I did find quite a number of students who fitted into this category, who said, for example, I'm really loving studying chemistry because the things we're learning, I could go on and work in the pharmaceutical industry, and I could perhaps help create a cure for malaria, and that would be a really good thing to do. So that the cure for malaria came through several times. So we can guess whether this is a national difference or year level, but that's there's a new instalment to be had about that. But while none of the first years actually explicitly said that what they were doing was for the social good, there are 2 assessments which I think have many of the qualities of what I mean by a responsive assessment, and so I want to share these with you. The first one is the Transport Project, and this is our engineering students. And the student describes, we had to think up a transport system for getting students from the city to the campus without using buses. We had to go through all the costing, all of the specific engineering principles of it. So how big the motor needed to be, how much energy it required, and all that kind of thing. That was quite interesting. And the reason I think this is a really good project is that there's a sense of solidarity, which is a core concept for Honneth. This is a local problem. This is students' own university, their own town, where there's a transport problem. There's uncertainty. They had 3 options to choose from, and none of them were correct, or, well, none of them were wrong. So they had to use their judgment about this. And in Hardison's terms, this is about the distinction between open and closed aims. So knowing the engine capacity of a certain piece of machinery is a closed aim. It's a building block, and that's perfectly legitimate. But the end is actually these open aims where there's uncertainty, where they're going on to solve problems of how do you have environmentally sustainable transport. And that's a question that will never be fully answered, because when they go into the workplace, they can't say, oh, I've come with the answer. because the problem will have changed by then. They have to be able to adapt and be always coming up. So that's why an open aim is very important. And the second project comes from the chemistry students. And the background to this is that apparently researchers at the University of Warwick came up with a new way of growing graphene. And this was a big deal in chemistry, and I don't at all suggest I understand it. But the academics at this university said, this is really exciting, cutting-edge research. Why don't we incorporate it into our teaching and make it part of the assessment? And so they came up with the Graphene Project. Now, I'm not sure whether this will work in translation, but as I read this quote, I'd like you to try and hear the way in which the student keeps inserting themselves actively into the process. We did 4 weeks in the lab growing graphene and testing that. You had to make your own labs, what concentration to use, what volumes of gas and pressure, and then you went through the CVD machine, you grew your own graphene on some copper or nickel, then you dissolved that in your own concentration of ammonium sulfate, which you had to make up from your own calculations, then tested it yourself on the infrared and UV vis and see what you made. Then you write up your own 4-page report with detail from other research and other theories. I think this is an incredible piece of work for students to be doing in first year, and not at the end of first year either. And it has the qualities of responsiveness because there's independence and responsibility here. They're engaging with cutting-edge research. There's active engagement with the research literature. They had to find 6 journal articles themselves and then use those in their report about what they'd done. And then they wrote it up in the format of the Royal Society of Chemistry. So again, there's this looking outwards to the professional body they aspire to be part of. And one of the interesting things about these students is their relationship to responsibility and risk over time. In the first year, they do have a lot of what are called lab recipes or scripts. So you follow 10 steps and you can be sure it will work out like this, you won't blow up the lab. The graphene assignment is different in this respect. By second year, they're having to do more open-ended tasks. And there's a real difference in how some students cope with this transition. And again, I'm afraid to say that's a story for the future. We learn more about it. So my last section is social and economic beyond the world of work, which may seem strange because I have been talking about industry and work, but let me explain what I mean. From a critical theory perspective again, there's a close interrelationship between the social and economic. We can't think of one without the other. And it's common to have debates about the purposes of higher education. Is it all about employment, or is it about the love of learning? But actually that's a false dichotomy. That's the wrong question to ask. The problem is not higher education having an economic role. Higher education does and must and should have. But the problem is the association of the economic with narrow interests, with the wealthy and the powerful, with employers, government and large businesses. When we think of the economic realm, we must also think of the poor, the dispossessed and the marginalised. They are just as much a part of the economic world. And the second thing is that disarticulation of the social and the economic. The economic realm does not exist as a value-free zone. It is socially constructed and part of who we are as social beings in a social world. So thinking about the social and economic and the importance of that, it did occur to me that some of the examples I've been using calling responsive assessment you might be thinking, well, that sounds an awful lot like authentic assessment to me. And in a way it is. So authentic assessment is often referred to as being about real-world tasks. But there's a false assumption, I'm going to suggest, a false assumption that the real world is simply the world of work. Let me be clear, work is a very important part of well-being, and if you're interested in this, Christopher Winch's work on this is excellent. But passive acceptance of a dominant economic power is not part of well-being. So we need to be clear what we're talking about when we talk about the world of work and the real world. And so I looked at over 100 journal articles that said they were about authentic assessment. And what I found in some was that they meant authentic assessment was about work-related tasks. Now that's okay if they're clear about that. But in others, there was this conflation of the real world and the world of work. One very helpful piece of research I came across was by Ashford, Rowe, Harrington and Brown. And they expand the notion of authentic assessment to include genuine intellectual challenge. And I think that's a really good component. But in other respects, they echo the other thing of what I found was this hazy relationship between work and wider society. But a really interesting exception in the literature comes from Forsyth and Evans, and they have a much more expansive understanding of real-world tasks, where the real world is neither benign nor power-free, and these are two historians writing about teaching and assessing history, so they're thinking about that in a post-colonial or decolonial age. And what these authors argue is that their aim is to transform and not just replicate the discipline. Again, remember, we're not just going round on a wheel doing the same thing. That's not what higher education's about. And they critically reconsider what is meant by authenticity. So it's a valuable term, but whose authenticity is it? How much contestation and variation is it? And they came up with 3 interlinked assessment strategies over the 3 years of the undergraduate degree. And I'll just give you 2 of them just to save time. The first, in first year, was a guerrilla history project. Now, guerrilla history, if you're not familiar with the term, means basically history from the other side, not from the side of the winner. So the best example I could come up with was this incredible book from an Australian Aboriginal historian called Henry Reynolds, The Other Side of the Frontier. It's a few decades old now, but it's still immensely powerful. And what he said is the whole history of Australia post-Europeans had been written from this direction, looking in. What happens if you look from this direction? Does it look the same? And of course what he discovered is no, it doesn't look the same at all. Those so-called facts of history start to crumble and change. So obviously on a much more modest scale, these students were set the task of thinking about the way the past is portrayed in a place, like perhaps a monument or something of that, a building, and to ask whose story is being told and what other stories might there be. And then to use primary sources, because these are history students, so that's important, to tell another story about that place. And they came up with all these things: original songs, board games, documentaries, podcasts, paintings, multimedia, clothing designed and produced, sculptures and mock monuments. What a wonderful array of interpretations of that assessment task. And please don't say to me, oh, but how would you write marking criteria for that? Well, of course you can. We're clever people. We can work that out. We can think about what are the important concepts, the important ideas trying to be conveyed here. We can do that. And again, I don't know about you, but sometimes I get blown away. It's very easy to be cynical about students and to talk about a consumer culture. But sometimes I get blown away by what our students can do. So then in the third year, they had a capstone project to build on the previous 2 years. And they had to do a community-engaged history. So the student had to approach an organisation they cared about. So that whole student is involved in this assessment because they're doing something they care about. They had to negotiate a history-based task valuable to that community, and they went to history societies, libraries, community and church organisations, school daycare, volunteer groups, and even an activist group like the Redfern Aboriginal Tent Embassy. And so they did their community-engaged history, but then these students, as a group, formed the Sydney Migrant History Society, and they developed materials for teachers teaching immigration history in school. So these are undergraduate students did this, and I think this is a splendid example of achievement represented by the practical application of knowledge in the social sphere and for the social good. And so what I hope to have shown by these examples is that what might seem the lofty idea of assessment for social justice is not a dream or fantasy. We can see it in existing assessment practices, but we can still enhance it and think more about it. So I leave you with Horkheimer, "It need not be so." It's a personal challenge I have, and it's a challenge I'd like to share with you. I said at the start I was worried I would be giving you an empty box, so I hope that you've found something helpful or interesting in what I've had to say. And gracias for having me, and I'd be very happy to continue this conversation with you here in person, by email or Skype. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias por la presentación. Si tenéis alguna pregunta, ya van a pasar el micrófono por ahí.
Can I ask a very practical question arising from that study of chemistry and chemical engineering? You identified some wonderful examples of things within the curriculum that went beyond what we might regard as conventional assessment. Can you give some indication of the extent to which those more oppressive assessment practices were dominant or not dominant in the curriculum that the students were talking about? So you've demonstrated that one can find, if one looks hard enough, interesting examples of what you're referring to, but to what extent were they kind of beleaguered, found in one institution? To what extent were they pervasive across all the sites? Does it give us more hope than the one example?
That's a very fair question. The answer would be yes and no. So the two examples were two different institutions, but they were atypical, they were unusual, and my feeling is that in many other respects, students are very much in these subjects on a treadmill. And it's a very difficult one. It's a very unforgiving one, because if you don't keep up, you're just going to fall behind. So it was certainly more traditional assessments, but I was impressed by the variety. And that even in, I can remember a quote from a student who said, "Oh, I really hate these assignments that involve words, like writing an essay, but I suppose I have to deal with words sometime in my life." So there was a variety there, which I found surprising. But these two examples, particularly the graphene example, that is very much a case of a small group of inspirational teachers who've done something different. And I have to say, in fairness, not all of the students embraced that as a great opportunity. Some did, but there was one student who was almost tearful, saying, "This isn't fair. They shouldn't do this to me in first year. They shouldn't give me a task that could go wrong." But the problem there isn't simply saying to that student, "Oh, okay, we won't do that." It's supporting them to understand that if you don't come to terms with the fact that things might go wrong in first year, when do you? And it comes back to this old argument about, oh, you can't do that with the first years, which always makes me so cross, because if we don't let the first years have real knowledge, when do they get it? When does it magically appear? When do they get the skills? How do they develop, in David's term, the evaluative judgment? That's going to take time, and it's got to start from first year. So I think what I was trying to say was that these show it is possible, even in these disciplines which from the outside might seem fairly inhospitable to, notions like social justice. But actually it's there.
Más preguntas, no seáis tímidos, venga. Gracias, Carmen.
Thanks, Jan. I've really enjoyed your presentation. It's made me think more deeply. I'm going to ask you what I ask all my colleagues from their expertise and their angle. So I think I'll check with you later, but one thing I do is look at programs and their design and assessment. And I'd like to know, from your point of view and with your expertise and insights, what would you ask of a program design to include and incorporate the principles you're talking about? So if you were looking, what would be the top thing to check, from your point of view? I think I've got an idea, but I want to hear, if you've got an idea of what would be 2 questions you would ask from a program in terms, if they've to address the social justice and your perspective.
The first one would be, goes back to the notion I mentioned briefly of forgiveness. Is the way assessment is structured over the whole program forgiving, in that students can make mistakes? Are students given an opportunity to learn? In other words, are they going to be penalised for not understanding in first year? Whereas actually we should be thinking the strongest student is surely the one who struggles in first year, puts the time in, thinks about it, and then comes out in third year, yeah, I've got it. The one who found it easy to start with and then coasts through, that's not the person I would employ, or I would want to be running a charitable group. So I think there needs to be space for forgiveness, and that's also a cultural thing, because students, we are all culturally conditioned that failure is bad. Of course, we don't like to fail, but we know that learning is an act of engagement over time. You try something, it doesn't work, so you try something else. And that has to be built in all the way through. And then the second thing, I suppose, would be this idea that we use building blocks, so we use closed aims, always to build towards open aims. And that those open aims are about something which is useful in the world of work, but also from a socially just perspective.
Thank you, Jan, for a very interesting and provocative keynote. And thinking, yesterday I asked David if change can happen in universities without senior management buy-in. Today I ask you, you said students are saying, what are you doing, giving me an assignment where I might go badly wrong? In risk-averse institutions in Australia, in Britain, in Spain, do the senior managers want assessment for social justice, or would they like it all to be nice and safe?
Yes, it was funny when you asked that question yesterday. I thought, yeah, that's going to relate to what I've got to say, very, very much so. So I suppose my answer is in two parts. Yes, I think that certainly in the UK context, which I know better, but what I think about Australia, that management is increasingly risk averse, and that this has an impact on what can be done. I do think, though, that academics are quite good at thinking around what management wants them to think. So, for example, I don't know whether you have this distinction in Spain, but in the UK we talk about teaching universities and research universities. And some people at research universities talk about the teaching ones as managerialist. But actually, I've worked in these universities, and on the one hand, they can be managerialist. But on the other hand, I have never seen such creative work by teachers to get around that and do interesting things. And the Graphene example comes from a teaching-only university, and I think it's a credit to that university. The interesting thing about the student, there was only one student who felt that it was unfair, but there could have been others, and of course this is the problem with qualitative research. You don't necessarily get the same things from everyone, what they choose to talk about. I agree completely that the conversation needs to go up the way, and this is something I grapple with, and I'm afraid I don't have an answer. The trite answer would be to say, oh yes, but if we all think differently, positive change will happen. And I know that's naive, but at the same time, if we don't all think differently, then definitely nothing will happen. But one of the other things that I want to argue is that some of the ideas which I have been framing in the context of social justice are actually really, if you take away that context, which I would urge you not to, but if you want to take it away, they're actually really good ideas about assessment. And they're really good ideas about how we answer the compelling questions of today. And yesterday when I was listening to David speaking, because I was going to follow on, I kept thinking, gosh, am I saying the same or am I saying different? And I felt that there was much more times when we were intersecting, I was perhaps saying it differently, but the core message about what matters in terms of what students can do and the reasonableness of assessment processes and the type of graduates we have are actually the same. And these are things that I do believe senior management cares about. The problem is that there's a lot of evidence that students are not as consumerist as they are made out to be. But the problem is they have a consumerist vocabulary. They're used to talk, they've been told to talk about that. I think management have the same problem, if I may say, that sometimes they just don't know how to talk differently about things. And then that would affect change. Sorry, I'm probably just some thoughts rather than an answer.
I'll ask you. I was curious about some guidelines you can provide about assessment and social justice in the different years of their studies. I mean, you talked about first year, and could you go deeper with this idea about the next years, or how can we start with the first year students?
That's really helpful. My view is that a first year is a wonderful year. It's a wonderful year to teach. I don't know whether other people find that, because in a sense you have these new students and their first experience of university, and you can help shape that. And as I said earlier, one of the things I strongly disagree with is the idea that we give our first years a watered down experience, you know, a faded, poor copy of the real thing because they're just first years. But at the same time, they are just first years. And so they need support. They need the forgiveness I talked about. They need not to be penalised for making a mistake. So I think in first year you introduce these ideas, because if you don't introduce them in first year, where is the right place to bring them in? But I do think that you have over time a reasonable development of taking responsibility, of risk. So as we see in our chemistry students between moving from first to second year, some of them are coping with that much better than others. And then in third year, looking out to who they are going to be when they go out into the wider world and into the world of work. So there's a relationship, but I do think it builds over time, and it has to build because we have to allow our students time to be students, to be learning, and to not know things, but there will be a progression over time. Does that?
Muchas gracias por tu presentación. In Spanish, please. Muchas gracias por tu presentación. Se han despertado algunas partes de mi cerebro que desconocía ahorita. Soy ingeniero. Y quisiera conversar contigo sobre mi contexto de país. Yo vengo de Honduras, de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Honduras, en un contexto de un país en desarrollo, un país que es conocido por malas noticias generalmente, pero quiero comprender parte de lo que lograste presentar en tu presentación sobre la sensación de logro, la sensación de solidaridad, la sensación de crecimiento personal y crecimiento social. Quizá en mi contexto y en el contexto de mi país, eso lo vivimos día con día. O sea, cada proceso educativo que estamos dando día con día, en la universidad por lo menos, donde en un país, como digo, en crecimiento, el costo de estar en una universidad es muy alto para el Estado. Una universidad pública, el 6% del presupuesto es nuestro. Ese contexto nos hace que cada logro, cada paso académico que damos es prácticamente una sensación de logro para el estudiante. Entonces, quisiera preguntarte cuál es tu experiencia en países en vías del desarrollo con esta sensación de logro, porque toda la investigación y toda la publicación que viene de países más desarrollados que el mío. Entonces, yo quisiera terminar de comprender esto, ya que nuestra escuela, digamos, viene desde la extensión universitaria que nació en Estados Unidos a principios del siglo pasado, y esa vinculación universidad-sociedad es prácticamente el día a día. Pero aquí pareciera que la investigación de vanguardia y de punta va hacia los polímeros, hacia SpaceX, o sea otras áreas del conocimiento, pero que la realidad de tocar el piso, de conversar con la gente y esa relación de generar gratitud, pareciera que eso es lo que hace que que se rete tanto el tema de justicia social como tú lo has hecho aquí. Quisiera preguntarte sobre tu experiencia.
Thank you. I'm afraid, I think that's a very legitimate question, and I'm glad you raised that, because we do all need to be reminded, and I mentioned briefly, you know, the movement about why is my curriculum white, and epistemic injustice, Miranda Fricker's work. And there is perhaps at the moment a fairly Eurocentric view that I've put across here, and I acknowledge that. I think this is where it's going to be different, looking at the South African data and already looking at that, because South Africa is a very interesting country in that it seems developed in some ways, and in others it really isn't. You know, it's very, the binary between poor and well off is extreme. And that's why I think, maybe echoing what you've found in your context, that might be why we see this sense of social achievement coming through, and it's only preliminary analysis. We see it coming through the South African data more. And the other thing that we see coming through there, which when I read some of the transcripts and people talking about why they were at university, they said, I'm here to get my family out of poverty. It is the only way. And when they mean poverty, they really mean poverty. And it is so different. I don't want to be disrespectful to our UK students or US who might themselves have financial problems, but they don't have poverty as it's meant in a South African context. And that does, I think, getting back to the idea of the student as a whole person, that's going to affect how they engage with knowledge, how they assess. And you're absolutely right that what we cannot do is, if I have understood correctly, we cannot just import ideas from the US or the UK and say, oh, here you are, aren't we kind, giving you our clever ideas. It won't work. There has to be a conversation, and it has to be locally based. And one of the things that's coming out of that project is the idea that context matters, and context matters in different ways. I hope that is some help. I would love to take this work and see how it worked in somewhere like Honduras, very much.
Hola Jan, buenos días. Me choca mucho que utilices el concepto de perdonar los errores, porque utilizar ese concepto implica que estás defendiendo un planteamiento donde la evaluación es sumativa y...
Sorry,
vale, sí.
Un segundo, Víctor.
Sí, espera.
Yes.
¿Empiezo? Que decía que me está extrañando, me está chocando el que utilices el concepto de perdonar los errores. Porque utilizar este concepto implica que entiendes que la evaluación es un proceso solamente sumativo, donde hay una calificación, en vez de entender que el error puede ser una fuente de aprendizaje si estamos en un proceso de evaluación formativa que dura un tiempo y donde le estamos dando la oportunidad al alumno de hacer más de una vez el mismo trabajo o el mismo ejercicio, o corregir al menos los errores de la primera presentación. Entonces me está chocando que desde una perspectiva crítica estés usando este concepto de perdonar el error. Yo creo que no hay que perdonar ningún error, simplemente hay que ofrecer a los alumnos la oportunidad de hacer las cosas más de una vez y que para la segunda vez puedan tener el apoyo y el feedback de su profesor o de compañeros o procesos de autoevaluación y evaluación compartida con el profesor, pero que la clave en estos procesos es que sea evaluación formativa y que haya oportunidad de hacer las cosas más de una vez y sobre todo de aprender los errores. O sea, yo creo que es mejor entender el error como fuente de aprendizaje que no el concepto de perdonar errores, porque el concepto de perdonar errores implica que estamos en otro tipo de evaluación, que tenemos en la cabeza otro tipo de evaluación. No sé si me he explicado.
Thank you. I agree, actually, with everything you said. And so I agree with everything you said. So it may be that I haven't explained what I mean by forgiveness well enough. Because actually, where I explain this in more detail, it is very much about the fact that we should be building in formative opportunities all the way, and that people learn by doing something. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but often the person who it hasn't worked for, they'll learn the most because they'll go away and try and rectify that. So I don't mean by forgiveness that we say, oh, it doesn't matter. The reason I chose that fairly emotive term, and I realise it is because I think that students, it's based on other work I've done with students who have failed exams, and it is summative in this context. But I found that students were so crippled, well, so worried by doing badly or making a mistake that it was stopping them learning. That they need, so what I was trying to convey is that they need to see learning as a safe place in which you try, it works or doesn't work, you get support, you talk to peers, as you said, you talk to your teachers, and it develops over time. So that's what I meant by it. I perhaps haven't explained it clearly enough, because I certainly agree with everything you said.
I was curious about if you know any institution which has planned or some guidelines for the teachers, for example, for first-year teachers, in order to assess or grade the students or perform these assessment ideas in the same way. I mean, because I think or I read that the students change their learning strategies or not, if they work or not, if they fail, they change them. So I think it's difficult because at least in my experience, teachers have a different assessment system or grading systems for the courses. So I think it's really hard for students to, in the transition to university, and when they have 5 or 6 different assessment systems or grading systems, when they start in their first semester, it's the most challenging situation for them. So maybe you know some institutions with clear guidelines for the teachers in order to be fair too.
I think that's really interesting, and I think it reminds me of debates about induction. I don't know whether that's, you know, the learning to be at university. And what used to happen is students would, in their first week, get lots of lectures about, you know, academic writing and referencing and how to cite and not plagiarise, and the importance of going to lectures, and then stuff about the counselling and the health service and the sports club. And I'd get all of this stuff in the first week. And then the academics would be able to say, right, well, somebody else is taking care of that. I can just talk my stuff. And this has been seen as increasingly very poor practice. And I worked with an institution where we were developing what was called longitudinal induction, or just-in-time induction. So what you do is You don't tell the student how to do referencing in week 1 and they don't apply it till week 9. That's not fair, that's not reasonable. You actually have to integrate it as you go, the support at different times. And teachers have to see that it is their responsibility. So there may seem an irony here that I said, well, this is all about engagement with knowledge. But teaching is about more than just sharing knowledge. It's about helping students to engage with that. There are pedagogical processes, and academics need to be supported to do that. And one of the things, another initiative is that many universities have writing centres. So if you have trouble writing, you go there. Well, that's good in one way, but that only gets some of the students some of the time. And we really don't do enough in first year to enable the space and time for students to learn what it is to be a university student and the skills, and to do that in partnership with teachers. So I do think teachers need to take on more of the responsibility, because this isn't something that you can put just in a week at the start or just in a centre over there. It's got to be all the way through as part of what they do in the business of teaching. Does that?
Última pregunta. Bueno, pues lo dejamos aquí. Creo que tiene... Bueno, un aplauso, muchas gracias. Y antes de irnos al café, creo que nos tienen algo que decir por ahí.
Tienen disponible, que ya tienen disponibles los certificados en la plataforma de Conferencia, a excepción del certificado de publicación, que se generará más tarde cuando la publicación ya sea definitiva. Si quieren sellar los certificados, pueden acudir a la mesa de registro y nosotros se los sellamos cuando traigan el documento impreso. A su vez, les quería comentar que en la mesa de registro pueden recoger tickets gratuitos para el bus turístico, perdón. El tour se llevará a cabo hoy, miércoles 26, de 1:30 hasta las 5 de la tarde. Y los buses pasan cada media hora. Muchas gracias por su atención, y cualquier información que necesiten, en la mesa de registro pueden contar con nosotros. Muchas gracias.